Everyone is worried about Europe imploding and the impact it could have, not just there, but all over the world, including the United States. I have two great economists and historians for insight. Robert Skidelsky is the authority on John Maynard Keynes, the great economist who advocated government spending to promote growth. On the other side, we have Harvard's Niall Ferguson, who usually takes a contrarian view. Gentlemen, welcome. Niall, first just give us a lay of the land. Everyone's saying, clearly not all euros are created equal. I'm going to put my money in German banks. That's the one country that can't default.
I was talking to a very senior Spanish official last weekend who said the problem is if one country leaves, this stops being a monetary union and it becomes just a currency board. And it's much easier to leave a currency board. He was thinking here of the parallel with Argentina. And the nightmare scenario is that these Mediterranean countries are each going to go the way of Argentina when it gave up its peg to the dollar, which was a currency board, a fixed link, and also converted currency deposits in the banking system to a new and much less valuable currency. That's the nightmare scenario that Southern Europeans are thinking about. I call this the Latin Europe problem, because Southern Europe, Latin Europe, is beginning to look more and more like Latin America. And if more is not done, in particular by the German government, to stem this crisis of confidence in Latin Europe, then it's game over for the euro.
Do you think there's a way for Greece to leave without it spreading the contagion?
Yes, I think so. I don't think Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland are nearly in as bad a condition as Greece. I think they're more competitive. I think their their budgets are in sounder condition. And I think they can weather that storm, particularly if there's a big enough firewall put up. So I don't think they have to leave. And so I'm not as pessimistic as Niall is that the whole thing will break up. But what I do agree with him is that it's got to be strengthened in all kinds of ways if it's to survive.
The central issue here has been this issue of austerity versus stimulus. Should there be more austerity? You guys met, we were all in London in July 2010, and the question I asked both of you was, are Britain's efforts that are to cut its budget deficit to what was regarded then as a kind of a version of austerity, is it going to produce a double dip, which many people worried about? So let's watch the clip. Is Britain going to go into a double dip?
I think there's a very strong chance that it will, yes.
What do you think?
I think it may dip, but I think it may also bounce back, and the world should watch very closely if this experiment comes off, because if it works, then Britain will be the role model, the poster child.
Do you think that, in retrospect, cutting spending at a time when the economy was weak was the wrong idea?
Well, there wasn't any choice, and that's the first thing to establish. You know, Keynesian policies are an option if you don't have an enormous debt-to-GDP ratio, but Britain already did when the Conservative government came in, or the Conservative Liberal government. Right, so and indeed, if you include private debt, second only to Japan in the world. So there really wasn't an option, and any government would have had to do the same thing, even if Labour had somehow managed to cling on to power.
I don't agree with that. I think Niall is a wonderful spokesman for the Conservative Liberal coalition. He's said exactly what they're saying, and I don't think any of it is correct. I think that there was never a chance that Britain was going to go the way of Greece. It was a sovereign, fully sovereign. Most of its debt was denominated in its own currency. It had a central bank that could print money. And so this is very, very different from the situation of those countries in the Eurozone. Britain did have an option. When you have a debt, a high debt, and when the economy has just collapsed, then of course the debt-GDP ratio rises automatically. Now, how do you get it down? That's the question. I would say, and a Keynesian would say, you don't get it down by shrinking the economy further. That is a move that will actually cause it to rise. You have to find some way of getting the GDP up, and then the debt GDP ratio will sink. And I think that's very, very clear in my mind, and I think events have borne it out. What we've had is a great experiment in the application of a particular economic philosophy, which Niall agrees with. He says, oh, well, this is a temporary blip, and in a year or so we'll be back to a buoyant growth.
I don't think it'll be buoyant growth. I think one has to recognise that under a debt mountain the size of Britain's, it is a mountain. Look, debt to GDP is up there with Japan. It's 600% if you include public and private debt.
If you include public.
Well, that's pretty important, Robert, because that's unprecedented in history. And anybody who thinks you can magically go back to 4 or 5% growth under such a burden is deluded, almost as deluded as the people who think that Britain had a Keynesian option in 2010.
Let me move to the subject that, of course, Americans care most about, which is America. One of the things you did argue was that the United States could also face these kind of spiraling interest rates and worries about borrowing. That certainly hasn't been borne out. I mean, American borrowing costs have just been plummeting over the last few years. Why do you think that is?
A massive flight to safety. I mean, if the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, which is as large, if not larger, as an economy than the US, is self-destructing, investors seek the safe haven of the US Treasury.
But does that mean
doesn't
that
guarantee you much return, but at least you get your capital back.
But does that mean that the US has more leeway?
It does,
for
yeah.
example, to do infrastructure projects?
It always has had more leeway. I always said that the crisis that was happening, this goes back 2 years now, in Greece would spread to the rest of the Mediterranean and might ultimately cross the Atlantic.
I don't think so. I think in one respect the United Kingdom has more leeway than American, just because it isn't a reserve currency. It can allow its currency to fall, to depreciate, without anyone taking any countermeasures. In the United States, the Chinese don't allow that to happen, essentially. So in that sense, Britain has more leeway, and it can have less austerity.
But
it has another growth path.
You would want more government spending across the Western world, correct?
I would like countries in the Eurozone, in the European Union, and in Britain, and in the United States, if necessary, to suspend their fiscal austerity programs. I would say put them into cold storage for years, go on borrowing, get the economy growing again, and then you come to the structural face the structural problems that you need to. If you do it now, you simply will get a shrinking economy. That's my prediction. I predicted it 2 years ago, and it's come to pass. Now, it may be wrong. Maybe next year we're going to have a resumption of growth everywhere. I think the risks are on the other side.
Final word?
I don't think that option exists for many countries right now. It certainly didn't exist for most of the European countries. It may conceivably exist for Germany, but remember, think of the argument that Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart have made repeatedly since they published This Time Is Different. Once you get up to a debt-GDP ratio of 90% or thereabouts, the room for manoeuvre is pretty much gone, and the debt itself starts to be the drag on growth. And that, unfortunately, is the position of the United States and indeed most countries in the developed world.
Niall Ferguson, Robert Skidelsky, a wonderful rematch. We'll have to do a third one this time, in Paris to do it as the French Open. Up next, why this week's UN summit in Rio will be a wasted opportunity. I have an interesting guest who will explain why.
There is perhaps 0.06% of all deaths in the developing world caused by global warming. There is 13% of all deaths caused by air and water pollution. Let's get our priorities right.